That birthday morning, sunlight sifted gently through the thin curtains, casting long, soft shadows across the worn wooden floor of my small kitchen. The kitchen where I had spent so many years stirring pots, humming old songs, and watching children grow. I had imagined today would feel different. Perhaps a tender warmth in my chest, a quiet celebration with those I loved. The kind of simple joy that years of shared history could bring. Instead, the house felt strange, like a museum, where I was merely a forgotten exhibit, touched only to dust and left to fade. I remember the delicate scent of the cake, fresh and sweet, filling the air, but none of the laughter or heartfelt smiles I had longed for came. My daughter, the one who once clung to me tightly during storms and whispered her dreams like secrets, barely glanced my way. Her eyes were distant, preoccupied with conversations that I was not part of. It was a subtle, aching silence that settled over the room, heavier than any shouted argument, could be louder than any anger. I realized in that stillness that I was no longer a part of their world, though I had carried it inside me for decades. The gifts carefully wrapped lay unopened, as if my presence alone was an obligation they endured, rather than a blessing they cherished. The realization grew slowly, like the creeping chill of autumn frost, seeping into the roots of an old tree that I had become an outsider in the family I had nurtured from the beginning. That day I felt the fragile thread connecting us begin to fray, not with a snap, but with the slow unraveling of quiet neglect and whispered exclusions. The birthday was mine by name only. In every other way, it belonged to the strangers who had edged their way in and pushed me quietly out. I sat at the edge of the table, hands folded in my lap, tasting the bitterness of invisibility and the hollow ache of being replaced. It was in this still aching moment that I knew something had shifted irreversibly, and that I would have to find my own way to reclaim what was left of me, even if it meant leaving them behind. I watched from the doorway as my daughter's house transformed around me, a place that once held the echoes of our laughter, the scent of Sunday dinners, and the warmth of shared memories. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, strangers began to fill her rooms. Her husband's family with their sharp eyes and colder smiles, stepping into every corner, rearranging the furniture of her life and unknowingly of mine. Their presence was like a tide that steadily rose, covering familiar ground, until only fragments of what I knew remained visible beneath the surface. I remember the first time I stayed for dinner after they moved in. The air was thick, with unspoken rules and subtle glances that cut sharper than words. Their conversations circled around me, excluding me with practiced ease, as if I were a ghost haunting a home that no longer belonged to me. I felt the weight of their judgment, not for who I was, but for what I represented, a past they seemed eager to rewrite or erase. It wasn't just the way they talked over me, but the way they claimed her time, her attention, her heart, leaving me on the edges, like a visitor without a voice. The daughter who once ran to me with wide eyes and open arms now hesitated, caught between two worlds, as if my place beside her had been quietly replaced by these new, colder presences. I held on to the hope that this was temporary, that love and history would bridge the growing divide. But with each passing day, their faces grew more familiar to her than mine, their values more accepted, their influence undeniable. It was a slow erosion, a silent invasion of the heart and home, until I realized I was no longer part of the family's future, only a fading shadow of its past. Watching from that doorway, feeling the chill of exclusion, I understood that sometimes the fiercest betrayal is the quiet kind, one that seeps in, unnoticed, until you are left standing alone in a house full of strangers. I had always believed that the little I could leave behind, some savings, a modest inheritance, would be a gift of love, a bridge to hold our family together even when words failed. So when I quietly set aside that money intended to help with the grandchildren's future, I did so with hope in my heart and trust that it would be received with gratitude, not greed or silence. But as time passed, that hope began to crack and then crumble. The money disappeared not in some grand confrontation or accusation, but like a shadow slipping through my fingers, vanished without a word, without acknowledgement, without even a whisper of thanks. It was as if the very thing I gave to hold them closer only pushed me further away, erasing the years of care and sacrifice with the cold efficiency of a ledger wiped clean. I remember the moment I noticed a casual mention of a new purchase, or a bill settled things paid for that I knew I had quietly funded. But when I brought it up, the conversation turned icy, their eyes darting away, their voices lowering to avoid the subject altogether. It wasn't just the loss of the money. It was the loss of connection, the realization that what I gave was not treasured as a symbol of love, but treated like a transaction to be taken without question. That disappearance carved a quiet wound inside me deeper than any harsh word could inflict, for it spoke of disregard, of invisibility cloaked in entitlement. Slowly the truth settled in my bones. The gift I had meant to bind us was used to widen the distance, to reinforce the walls they had built around themselves and between us. And with that quiet betrayal, I began to understand that sometimes the severing of ties isn't marked by fire and fury, but by the absence of gratitude and the slow fading of respect. Their hands didn't stop at the finances. They reached into every corner of her life, shifting and reshaping the home she once shared with me, like clay molded by unfamiliar fingers. The rooms I had filled with memories, the faded curtains I had sewn, the old wooden table where we gathered every evening, were replaced, redecorated to suit tastes I didn't recognize. Each new item, each carefully chosen color and fabric, seemed designed to erase what had been, to build a new narrative that excluded me entirely. I remember walking through her front door one afternoon, the smell of fresh paint mingling with cold, unfamiliar scents of polished marble and plastic blooms. The walls wore new faces, artworks that told stories. I wasn't part of furniture that gleamed with a hardness, reflecting the growing distance between us. It felt like watching a house become a stranger, a hollow shell, where my presence was only a faint echo easily forgotten. The warmth that once radiated from every corner had been replaced by a clinical sterility that chilled the heart. Even her voice seemed to shift in this new space, polished, restrained, less willing to share the intimate moments that had once flowed freely between us. In the midst of this transformation, I found myself retreating, a silent observer, mourning the slow disappearance of a home I thought was ours. And somewhere between the walls, now covered in their chosen colors and the absence of familiar laughter, I understood that they weren't just redecorating a house, they were redrawing the boundaries of belonging, and I was no longer invited inside. That day is etched deep into my memory, the moment I walked into the living room and saw the family photos all face down, like secrets turned away, stories silenced in an instant. Each picture was a thread in the tapestry of our shared history, images of birthdays, holidays, laughter, tears, and quiet moments that bound us together over decades. But now they lay discarded, as if the memories they held were too painful or inconvenient to face. It was not just the act of flipping them over, it was the message it carried, as loud as any shouted accusation. I was being erased, my place in the family denied without a word. I remember the sting of that silence, the weight of absence heavier than any confrontation, the eyes that once looked back at me from those frames, my own, my children's, my grandchildren's, were hidden behind a veil of cold rejection. It was a betrayal so subtle it could be mistaken for neglect, but I knew better. To turn a photo away is to turn a person away, to refuse to see them in the story of your life. In that quiet room, I felt the walls close in the house, no longer a refuge, but a reminder of loss. And as I gathered the photos, slowly turning them right side up, I realized that some wounds are invisible, carried in the silence between actions, in the refusal to acknowledge what once was sacred. That day, the betrayal settled into my bones, not with a roar, but with a whispered finality that told me I was no longer part of their picture. I often find myself drifting back to the days when my daughter was that little girl who clung to my hand like it was the only anchor in a stormy sea. Her tiny fingers would curl tightly around my skirt, as if afraid the world might whisk her away if she let go. We shared whispered secrets, those delicate exchanges of trust that only a mother and child can hold, stories spun from innocence and boundless hope, promises to keep each other safe. But over time, those hands that once sought mine began to hesitate, withdrawing slowly, like a candle's flame flickering in a cold draught. I noticed the quiet distances growing between us, not marked by shouting or tears, but by silences thick with unsaid words and unshed tears. The daughter who once confided in me now shared her heart with other strangers who didn't know the language of her childhood or the rhythm of our bond. I mourned the loss silently, feeling the erosion of trust and closeness as a slow, aching unraveling of the fabric that had held us together. There were moments when I reached out, hoping to bridge the widening gap, but my touch was met with coldness or indifference, as if my presence was a weight she no longer wished to carry. That little girl, once bright-eyed and fearless, seemed swallowed by a world that demanded she forget her roots to fit in. In the quiet of those fading memories, I understood that betrayal often wears the face of abandonment, not by force, but by the slow retreat of love that once burned bright. And so I grieved not just for what was lost, but for the daughter who no longer recognized the hands that had held her through every storm. There was a time when my voice mattered, when my thoughts and wishes carried weight at the family table, when my opinions shaped decisions small and large. But those days slipped away like sand through my fingers, unnoticed at first, until I found myself outvoted, dismissed, and quietly sidelined in the very family I had raised. Every suggestion I offered, whether about a holiday plan or the grandchildren's education, was met with polite nods that quickly dissolved into decisions made without me, as if I were an unwelcome guest, observing from a distance. The words "we've already decided" became a refrain that echoed in every conversation, sealing me out from the heart of our family's life. It wasn't the exclusion that hurt most. It was the slow creeping realization that I was no longer seen as a mother or a matriarch, but as a burden, an obstacle to their progress and happiness. I remember the sting of trying to speak up and being talked over, the polite smiles that masked impatience, the way my concerns were dismissed as irrelevant or outdated. In those moments, I felt myself shrinking, not just physically, but into a shadow of the woman I once was, a silent observer of a family that had outgrown me. The betrayal wasn't loud or violent. It was the quiet, steady erasure of my presence, the subtle but relentless message that I no longer belonged in the decisions that shaped our lives. And as I sat in that silence, I realized that sometimes being outvoted is more than a disagreement. It's a declaration that you are no longer part of the family's future. I can still hear the hushed voices, the sharp edge beneath their polite tones, the way they said, I was holding her back, as if I were a chain tethering her to a past she desperately wanted to escape. They spoke of progress and change, of new beginnings and fresh starts, and in their words I was cast as a relic, a shadow better left behind. It wasn't an accusation shouted across a crowded room, but a quiet conspiracy whispered in corners designed to isolate and diminish me. I remember the crushing weight of those words sinking into my heart, a slow, relentless ache that grew with every passing day. They didn't see the years I had poured into raising her, the sacrifices made silently and without complaint. They only saw an obstacle to the future they wanted to build. I watched as she too began to believe their version of the story, distancing herself with tentative steps, as if afraid that holding on to me would chain her to the very past she wished to forget. The betrayal in their judgment was not just toward me. It was the betrayal of a daughter who chose strangers over her own mother's love. Yet in the quiet spaces between their words, I found a flicker of something stronger, a resolve to reclaim my dignity, to refuse to be erased, simply because I was deemed inconvenient. The realization dawned slowly. I did not need their approval or their acceptance to know my worth, and their judgment would not define the legacy I carried within me. There came a day when I simply stopped, reaching out, stopped offering my help, stopped weaving myself into the fabric of their lives, and to my surprise, no one noticed. The calls went unanswered, the invitations ceased, and the small kindnesses I had always extended, meals, cooked errands, run the quiet presence at family gatherings, were suddenly absent, but their absence was met with indifference rather than concern. It was as if I had become invisible, a ghost whose fading light went unnoticed in a house filled with new faces and new priorities. At first I thought they would ask why I withdrew, sense the growing distance, and reach out to bridge it. But silence answered my retreat, a silence louder than any argument or accusation, echoing with the hollow absence of love and care. I felt the sting of being forgotten, not in a moment of anger or pain, but in the slow, gradual neglect that told me I was no longer essential, no longer wanted. The realization was bittersweet. On one hand, it hurt to be so easily cast aside, but on the other, it freed me from the exhausting effort of trying to hold together a family that no longer needed me. I began to see that sometimes the greatest betrayal is not what is done to us, but what is left undone, the care withheld, the questions not asked, the love that quietly slips away. And in that quiet space, I learned to find strength in my solitude, to cherish my own company, and to reclaim the parts of myself that had been lost in the shadows of neglect. The day they took her name off my mailbox was a quiet punctuation to a story I had long sensed unfolding, one that spoke more in symbols than in words. The small brass plaque that once bore her name alongside mine was removed as if to erase our connection from the very threshold of my home. It wasn't a confrontation or a heated exchange. It was a silent declaration, a subtle severing that cut deeper than any argument could. I remember standing there, keys in hand, the weight of that small, empty space settling over me like a winter frost. It felt as though they were telling me without saying a word that I no longer belonged, not in their world, not in their hearts, not even on the mailbox that marked the boundary between our lives. The betrayal was not loud. It was a hush, a quiet pulling away that left me wondering how something so small could carry such a crushing message. I thought of all the years we had shared the storms weathered together, the laughter and tears that had once filled these spaces, now replaced by absence and cold distance. That empty spot on the mailbox became a symbol of everything lost. A family unmoored, a love withdrawn, a place I was no longer welcome to claim. And in that silence I found a quiet clarity. Sometimes the sharpest pain comes not from what is said, but from what is taken away without notice, leaving only the hollow echo of what once was. The day they took her name off my mailbox was a quiet punctuation to a story I had long sensed unfolding, one that spoke more in symbols than in words. The small brass plaque that once bore her name alongside mine was removed as if to erase our connection from the very threshold of my home. It wasn't a confrontation or a heated exchange. It was a silent declaration, a subtle severing that cut deeper than any argument could. I remember standing there, keys in hand, the weight of that small empty space settling over me like a winter frost. It felt as though they were telling me, without saying a word, that I no longer belonged, not in their world, not in their hearts, not even on the mailbox that marked the boundary between our lives. The betrayal was not loud. It was a hush, a quiet pulling away that left me wondering how something so small could carry such a crushing message. I thought of all the years we had shared, the storms weathered together, the laughter and tears that had once filled these spaces, now replaced by absence and cold distance. That empty spot on the mailbox became a symbol of everything lost, a family unmoored, a love withdrawn, a place I was no longer welcome to claim. And in that silence I found a quiet clarity. Sometimes the sharpest pain comes not from what is said, but from what is taken away, without notice, leaving only the hollow echo of what once was. The attic had become a place I avoided for years, a dusty cavern where forgotten memories lay tangled with cobwebs and time. But when I finally climbed the creaking stairs, each step felt like a return to myself, a pilgrimage through the fragments of a life I had almost lost. Boxes packed with faded photographs, yellowed letters, and worn trinkets told stories of laughter and love, of sacrifices made in silence and dreams nurtured in the quiet hours of the night. As I sifted through the relics of my past, a strange clarity settled over me. Amidst the dust and forgotten things, I found my power waiting patiently. These objects were more than memories. They were pieces of my identity, fragments of a woman who had loved fiercely and lived fully despite the betrayals that had scarred her heart. I realized that reclaiming these pieces was not an act of nostalgia, but an act of resistance. A way to assert that I still belonged, that my story was not over, and that I held the right to shape what came next. In that quiet attic, surrounded by echoes of a life well lived, I began to breathe again, to feel the steady pulse of my own worth beating beneath the layers of dust. The past and present merged in that space, reminding me that even when others turn away, I could choose to face myself with kindness and strength. I still remember the exact moment I picked up the phone and made that quiet call to the lawyer, the weight of years pressing down on my chest, a mixture of sorrow, relief, and resolve swirling within me. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no angry words or ultimatums, just a deliberate, calm step toward reclaiming control over the life and legacy that had been slipping through my fingers. The papers were already prepared, waiting patiently for my signature, a testament to the quiet strength I had been gathering in the shadows. As I signed, I felt a strange peace settle over me, a silent victory not marked by noise or confrontation, but by the gentle assertion of my dignity and self-respect. The legal language etched on the documents was cold and precise, but beneath it lay the heartbeat of my silent justice, a way to say that I would not be erased, that I would not be forgotten, and that my worth was not defined by the shifting tides of family favor. In the stillness of that moment, I realized that sometimes the most powerful acts are the quietest, the ones that don't demand attention, but quietly rewrite the rules. The betrayal I had endured was met not with anger or vengeance, but with a calm, unwavering strength that honored my journey and protected the legacy I chose to leave behind. And with that single call, I closed a chapter that no longer served me and stepped forward into the silence I had longed for. Walking through the house one last time, I traced my fingers along the surfaces, where memories lingered like ghosts, each room a chapter of a story, rewritten by those who never truly belonged. The furniture I left behind held echoes of laughter and tears of late-night talks and quiet mornings, but I knew that for them these pieces were mere objects to be replaced, discarded without thought or care. I chose carefully what to give and what to keep, understanding that some treasures were meant for those who had earned them, and others were better left in the past's dusty corners. I burned old letters that no longer held warmth, symbols of a family, fractured by silent betrayals, and whispered exclusions, letting the flames carry away the pain that words could no longer soothe. Yet I kept the small things, the faded photograph, the worn quilt, the locket, with a secret inscription, tokens of resilience and love that no one could take from me. In that act of letting go, I reclaimed my story, deciding what part of my life to share and what to hold sacred. I left behind nothing but what was deserved, nothing but the truth of a family that had chosen to turn away. And as I stepped out the door, the weight of years lifted just enough to let me breathe, to feel the quiet strength of a woman who had lost much, but refused to lose herself. The morning I left the house was still wrapped in the soft glow of dawn that barely touched the coldness I felt inside. I packed my life into a few sturdy bags, each item a fragment of my past, each memory a step toward a future I could no longer share with those who had replaced me. There was no dramatic goodbye, no slammed doors or shouted farewells, only the quiet sound of footsteps on the gravel, the soft click of the front door closing behind me, and the weight of finality settling like a gentle dusk. I left them nothing, no keys to hold on to, no possessions to claim, no last words to argue over, just silence. A silence that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. As I walked away, the house stood empty, a monument to what had been and what was no longer mine to hold. The betrayal had been silent, slow, and insidious, but so was my departure, a quiet surrender to the dignity I refused to sacrifice. In that stillness, I found a strange peace, a freedom born not from vengeance, but from the reclaiming of my own worth. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it, I found peace. The days after I left were soft and slow, like the fading light at dusk that gently wraps the world in a quiet embrace. In the silence, I found there was space to breathe, space to feel the depth of loss without being overwhelmed, space to cradle the pieces of myself I thought had been broken beyond repair. I learned that freedom is not loud or sudden, but a quiet unfolding, a gentle opening of the heart to what remains when everything else falls away. Dignity settled in like a warm shawl, wrapping me in its tender strength, reminding me that even when others choose to turn away, I still hold the power to stand tall. Self-respect became the steady rhythm beneath my footsteps, a silent justice that needed no applause or witnesses, only the knowing that I honored myself. In the stillness, I found a new kind of family, one built from resilience, memory, and the quiet courage to begin again. And though the past whispered its sorrows, I listened with compassion, letting go without bitterness, holding close the lessons that pain had taught me. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it, I found peace.